The idea of there being gray Jedi has been around for a long time. I think it spawned originally from the Knights of the Old Republic game in reference to the fact that there's this morality scale, and the more upstanding, morally righteous things you do, you go into the blue, which represents the light side, and the more twisted, immoral, or straight up evil things you do brings you into the red, which is the dark side. But there is a middle ground that your character starts in, which is labeled as being gray. So it's in between the Jedi and the Sith, or the light and the dark, however you want to put it. But it's only recently that I've seen the gray Jedi be referenced as their own sort of faction, with their own belief system, and that's what I take issue with, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So because this concept sort of almost inadvertently spawned from Knights of the Old Republic, it seems intuitive that the characters we'll be looking at today are both from Knights of the Old Republic. The first I wanted to mention, this is the guy that comes up if you literally just type Gray Jedi into Google, is Jolee Bindo, which is one of your followers in the first Knights of the Old Republic. Now, he's considered a Gray Jedi because he takes issue with many of the things that the Jedi preach, or that the Jedi have simply as, strict rules in their code, in their Jedi code. You can immediately sort of debunk this guy as having any sort of Gray Jedi philosophy when you look at some of the things that set him apart from the Jedi Order. A couple of the main things that he mentions that set him apart from the Jedi Order are that, one, he's a smuggler, but what is he smuggling? He's mentioned that he smuggles goods to starving worlds and just people in need. So I wouldn't say that's something a malicious person would do. And the main thing that he talks about throughout the game, and the main thing that he doesn't like the Order for, disagrees with the code for, is how love is forbidden. And Jolee mentions how he fell in love with and married a woman. So his reasons for separating himself from the Order are legitimate, and his issues that he takes with the Order are also in good faith. And throughout the game, he's one of the characters that sort of speaks good into your ear the most. Whenever you're presented with the ability to sway a situation, which often you are, especially in Knights of the Old Republic, he's always sort of preaching the good choice in your ear. So Jolee is still a very morally righteous person. He is still a Jedi who is a force for good in the universe. Other famous Jedi that would be considered to be gray would be, how about Qui-Gon? And Qui-Gon is still, part of the Order, but they don't want to make him a master because he, again, takes very similar issues with the code, similar to Jolee's issues. But I would certainly say that Qui-Gon is still of the light. Jolee and Qui-Gon are both still very clearly righteous light side users. So Gray Jedi being a definition for Jedi who are still morally righteous, still certainly situated with the light side, but that take issue with certain sort of specific aspects of how the Jedi Order runs, that's fine. That definition is fine. That's been around for a long time. But recently, as I said, has cropped up the concept that the Gray Jedi are their sort of own third faction. And I want to take a look at some pictures that have sort of made their rounds on Twitter and Facebook or whatever Star Wars circles you're in. So the one that I've been seeing, and I'll take a look at two actually, because there are many variants of them, it shows the Sith code and the Jedi code and then the Gray code in the middle. And the one thing I think is funny right off the bat is that whoever these people are who are making these things, they can't seem to agree on a Gray code. I've seen a lot of different Gray codes, but today I'm going to sort of look at the two that I've seen spread most widely on the internet. So the Gray Jedi code is: there is no light without the dark. Through passion, I gain focus. Through knowledge, I gain power. Through serenity, I gain strength. Through victory, I gain harmony. There is only the Force. Okay, so you can see what they did. They took words from both the Jedi and the Sith codes and just sort of combined them. So yeah, this is a fine insight on how life and the world and the universe works, but does it as a philosophy hold up? I don't think so, and I'm going to talk about sort of why I think it doesn't in a minute here. But let's take a look at the second one, which is very similar. There is no dark side nor a light side, there is only the Force. I will do what I must to keep the balance. There is no good without evil, but evil must not be allowed to flourish. There is passion, yet peace. There is serenity, yet emotion. There is chaos, yet order. So they did a similar thing here where they sort of took the key words from both the Sith and the Jedi codes and put them together. Now, there's one thing I want to mention mostly, which is the line that says, I will do what I must to keep the balance. So that doesn't really work as a philosophy. What does that mean? You know, are you going to give some food to the homeless and then take it away? Are you going to save a life and then end a life? That is not representative of any kind of force on the world. That is sort of a net zero effect that you are putting onto the universe. And that doesn't represent a philosophy, that represents a lack of philosophy. And most people are in the gray area somewhere, but it's not because of any kind of philosophy or ideals, it's because of circumstances, right? Most just run-of-the-mill folks who are trying to get by, they're somewhere in that gray area. There's a show, I'm gonna go outside of the Star Wars box here for a minute, but there's a show called The Good Place that's about the fact that there's a sort of supernatural epidemic going on where everyone's going to hell. Because on Earth nowadays, it is tremendously difficult to avoid doing bad things, like, you know, buying clothes or phones or anything that contributes to child labor, etc., etc. And it's a look at how, hey, these people at their core aren't bad people, but they're put into circumstances where they have to be a part of something that is malicious and immoral. So I'm sure that works for the Star Wars world as well. I'm sure that is true of most people in the Star Wars universe, that they are gray. And the fact that in Knights of the Old Republic you start in that gray area, that is very telling of that. Any just regular old person, you're going to start in that gray area, and you're going to, for the most part, unless you can break out of that mold and be either incredibly altruistic and selfless like the Jedi, or incredibly evil and power hungry like the Sith, you're going to stay on that single track, okay? And by the end of those games, it's incredibly rare and almost impossible to end it in that same middle spot. I don't think anyone really does that, and you'd have to try really hard to do that if you wanted to, because that's not really the point of the game. The point of the game is to grow from that gray area, but that gray area is not a point that is to be continued. But yes, I don't think any of these gray Jedi philosophies represent a philosophy at all. I think they represent nihilism, which is a lot of what Knights of the Old Republic 2 is about, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. Right off the bat, we have Creia, Darth Sion, and Darth Nihilus. So the writers knew this going into Knights of the Old Republic 2. They knew that the philosophy they were preaching was a sort of nihilism, which is literally, if you look up nihilism, it's sort of the lack of a philosophy, the lack of any moral scale, or the sense that anything matters at all. So it can't really be its own code, because the code is I don't care, which isn't really a code at all, and isn't something that can be practiced in the world. But the most interesting character, the most polarizing character that is truly, I think, most representative of what we think of when we think gray Jedi, or just when we're thinking of that gray area in between the Jedi and the Sith at all, is of course Creia. She's a very well-written character. She promotes her stance very eloquently throughout the game. But once you reach the end of the game, from my perspective, she was always clearly a villain. So if you don't know anything about Creia, she began as a Jedi, and she became a master and taught a bunch of Padawans, and many of her Padawans fell to the dark side. She became disgruntled with this, and she thought that maybe as a way to avoid having students fall to the dark side, we should teach them about it. And so she herself learned of the dark side, turned into a dark side user, and from there, because she still is sort of a more strong-willed character, she didn't just become bad like most dark side users would. She thought that, hey, I disagree with the Jedi and I disagree with the Sith. How can we do away with both of them? So she thinks that the Force is almost this tangible entity that is inspiriting the Jedi and the Sith with their will to do battle with each other. And I take issue with her idea of what the Force is at all. When George Lucas talks about the Force, it is, in all senses, a sort of modern look at God, or simply the energy of the universe. Creia thinks of the Force as something that is holding us. She thinks of it as you would in the sense of like ancient Greek fate, where you are bound to a certain fate. Where when George describes it, he describes it as something that we are influenced by, but that we also influence. Creia forgets that we are all a part of the Force. All planets, beings, everything is a part of the Force. Sort of all of reality is the Force. So to do away with it is this theoretically odd, seemingly impossible idea. But she seems to think that if the Force is just gone, then beings won't feel compelled to do battle with each other. But that's just the law of nature, right? That's how our world works. That's how the universe works. Things kill other things to create new life. There always has to be conflict. Conflict creates progress. She wanted to do away with the Force entirely. And the way that she was going to go about doing this would result in the majority of life in the universe dying. So she was going to kill most of life on every planet in the Star Wars galaxy, knowingly, because she believed that those that were left would no longer be compelled to do any kind of wrong. Now, this strikes me as something that we've seen before. I'm thinking Ozymandias in The Watchmen and Thanos in The Avengers, who are both the sort of center villains of their stories.
Perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
Killing millions
to save billions.
Creia is no different. She promotes her argument in a more compelling way. A lot of the philosophies she preaches throughout the game are much more interesting, some of which aren't really vile at all, because like any good villain, she thinks she's doing the right thing. And for instance, one of the things that I agree with is when you go to Nar Shaddaa, you have the option of being a very charitable person and giving to the homeless, but you see that giving a bunch of money to the homeless person right off the bat isn't necessarily going to do good. We see in our own world that a lot of the time, if you are on the side of the road and a homeless person comes up to you, you give them some money, they might spend that on a shot or something rather than some food. And in the case of the game, you see that this homeless guy gets mugged for the money moments later. And Creia tells you that no, you shouldn't just give money to these people. They should be able to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, as difficult as that may be, because that's the only way their push towards a better life will stick, is if they take the initiative. And certain things like that I agree on, and it makes total sense. It's certainly not what a Jedi would do, again, like Jolee Bindo, who is also considered to be gray. He's literally breaking the law in order to give food to those who are in need of it. Now, I see both sides of that coin, and I don't think either view is necessarily malicious. However, do I think annihilating the majority of the universe because you think that maybe, in theory, the Force itself will then die, and so this small group of people can live this sort of stagnant, boring life? That doesn't sound too good. And the game, Knights of the Old Republic 2, does a really great job of making you really question her philosophies and beginning to want to agree with them. Because it pairs her with other Jedi like Atris, who is, first of all, seen in all white, and that's not random. Of course, every character in the Knights of the Old Republic is very purposefully named and purposefully appearing. So we see Atris in all white because she's this almost quixotic Jedi. If you go too far and become too literal with the Jedi code, then bad things can happen there as well. And so Atris does a great job of painting Creia as a more understandable, reasonable figure than she really is. And at the end of the game, it's also revealed, she tells you up front, I used you. Darth Sion and Darth Nihilus turned on her and cut her connection to the Force. They severed her connection to the Force. So she literally tells you at the end of the game, because I could not any longer carry out that which I sought to do, I used you in order to try and make it happen. So not only did she intend to wipe out the majority of the universe, she completely manipulated and used the main character. This does not sound like a gray Jedi to me. This sounds like a villain, like Ozymandias or Thanos. Now, Jolee Bindo, he doesn't sound morally gray either. He sounds like a light side, morally upstanding user who simply does not happen to align with the literal faction of the Jedi Order. So I do not think that there is a gray Jedi philosophy. I think Creia is certainly a villain and Jolee Bindo is certainly a hero. Neither of them are part of the Jedi Order, neither of them are part of the Sith, but one cannot align with neutrality. Every action you take swings slightly or not so slightly one way or the other. Neutrality is a lack of action, a lack of philosophy. It does not stand in between the Jedi and the Sith. Even the term gray area does not mean not good or bad. It means that you need to take a closer look, and it's a bit more complicated than just seeing, hey, Yoda, there's a good guy. The Emperor, there's a bad guy. Even in the realm of any gray area, gray Jedi included, there is a truth of whether they are good or bad, whether they are light or dark.